This channel is part of the History Hit network. Stick around to find out more.
He's France's worst villain, hounding Jews, persecuting Jews.
Paul Touvier sent my mother to Auschwitz.
Members of the Catholic Church who were pro-Nazi helped him escape.
My job is to arrest Mr. Touvier.
Finding the man is not going to be easy.
They searched a number of monasteries.
We were stepping into a sacred place.
When I started, nothing could stop me.
World War II has been over for 43 years. Yet France's most notorious war criminal is still at large. A Nazi collaborator who murdered Jews and resistance fighters alike, Paul Touvier. Now, a high-ranking French detective has the job of hunting him down.
It was in March 1988 when a magistrate of the Paris court gave me the Touvier case.
Colonel Recordon is someone who's very determined. When he decides to do something, he'll do everything he can to make it happen.
Il met tous les moyens pour y aboutir.
Over the years, the French National Police have tried and failed to bring the war criminal to justice. But Colonel Jean-Louis Recordon has a hard-won reputation as a tough and skilled investigator. His latest mission is top secret.
For roughly 40 years, Touvier was hidden somewhere and nobody was able to arrest him.
Combing through the Touvier case files, Recordon is transported back to one of the darkest periods in French history. When the Nazis invaded France, some Frenchmen heroically resisted. Others, like Paul Touvier, wholeheartedly collaborated.
He worked with the Germans during the war. In fact, they joined with German units to actually fight against the resistance.
As one of the leaders of a pro-Nazi paramilitary force, Touvier's job was hunting down enemies of the state.
Touvier selected 7 people, and he said himself it was because they were Jewish. They were stood up against the wall and shot. Simple as that.
He's France's worst villain.
Even in the 1980s, there are people in high places who collaborated with the Nazis. People who are sympathetic to Paul Touvier.
I was concerned about potential leaks because I was fully aware about the fact that in the French administration, but not only in the French administration, in the French society, Touvier had supporters.
When someone's been hiding for 40 years, the chances of finding him are next to nothing.
Quasi nul.
I mentioned to the magistrate the fact that this case should be an impossible mission. But when I started, nothing could stop me.
For this mission impossible, Colonel Recordon teams up with seasoned investigator Dominique Bélanger.
When I received the Paul Touvier file, I knew it was very sensitive. Our division only dealt with very sensitive cases. It was a secret investigation.
I was fully blind, I would say. I have no information about his current physical appearance, of course.
The problem with searching for Paul Touvier was that we didn't even know if he was alive. Touvier faked his own death because at some point he had put a notice in the newspaper Paul Touvier is dead.
Paul Touvier est mort.
But since there was no
Néanmoins,
proof of
tant
his
qu'on n'avait
death,
pas la preuve de sa
we
mort,
continued with the
il fallait
investigation.
continuer à faire une enquête.
Counts.
I started to define the Touvier networks, his relatives, his supporters, and all people mentioning in the dossier. And I was interested by one fact. I noticed several times the influence of the Catholic Church.
It has long been rumored that Paul Touvier has been sheltered by elements within the French Catholic Church.
C'est qu'il
He
a
clearly had received some important support.
manifestement important.
If it's true, it wouldn't be the first time that sympathetic clergy have aided and abetted Nazi fugitives.
I think members of the Catholic Church who were pro-Nazi helped people escape after the war.
The church had this tradition of standing outside the secular authority and assisting those people in trouble without asking any questions.
This part of the French story is always very controversial.
It does seem very fishy that everybody who helped the Nazis happened to be connected to the Catholic Church.
The hunt for war criminal Paul Touvier has exposed deep religious and political divisions in France that date back decades. When the Germans defeated France in 1940, they carved the nation in half. The Nazis occupied the north. In the south, they set up a puppet government based in the town of Vichy. The Vichy government created their own version of the Gestapo, the fearsome milice.
The milice was created essentially as a paramilitary police force to fight the resistance. It's an expression in its ideology of the most extreme elements in Vichy. It's overtly anti-Semitic.
And Touvier made a career in the milice, and he really took to it. And he did so well that he was promoted. He became the person in charge of intelligence gathering for the milice office.
He was an absolute ideological fanatic. The Jews and the resistance, these were enemies of France, and they were to be eliminated.
Well, after the war, there was a serious effort in France to purge French society of people who had collaborated with the Germans.
Collaborators like Paul Touvier, who was desperate to avoid the hangman's noose.
Touvier came from a devout Catholic family. He was a devout Catholic himself. And when he looked around for help, he thought perhaps the church could help him.
I assumed the Catholic Church could be an important element to be investigated.
Recordon discovers that Touvier's last known mailing address is the Lyon archdiocese.
We wanted to obtain the authorization to examine the archives of the Archbishop.
It was quite a delicate inquiry.
Très sensible.
The magistrate and the detective drive 300 miles south to Lyon. They decide the magistrate will meet with the Archbishop alone to gain his trust.
We obtain a meeting with the Archbishop, but I stay outside the Archbishop office. I was very anxious. It was sensitive. The Archbishop was very reluctant to authorize the police to investigate Catholic archives.
Recordon's request to see the archive is turned down flat, only fueling his suspicions.
For me, It's an habit to meet numerous people who don't want to cooperate with me. It's not a problem for me. Okay, you don't want to cooperate directly? Okay, I will use another way.
9 months into the investigation, Recordon is convinced that Touvier is being hidden by elements within the Catholic Church.
To remain impossible to find, to stay hidden while in France, the perfect place for this was a religious setting, whether in monasteries or abbeys that could shelter entire families or individuals.
Police concentrate on the right-wing fundamentalist movement within the church.
We were focused mainly on one in the monastery. Due to the fact that Touvier worked for a certain time in the 70s around this monastery.
It is the Notre-Dame-des-Doms monastery in central France.
I decided to send Bélanger inside the monastery in order to find some clues of the presence of Touvier or his family.
Officer Bélanger goes undercover, posing as an ex-convict seeking charity.
We were stepping into a privileged, secretive place. It's another world, cloistered and also protected.
It was a very impenetrable system and very effective.
Très au point. It's very difficult to infiltrate these religious communities. There's an element of mistrust. Very few lay people gain access. I worked there during the day and at night had the run of the abbey.
Bélanger searches for clues.
Every detail we gathered motivated us.
But the undercover operation yields little.
There were several people staying at the monastery, but none of them resembled Touvier. It was demoralizing. We had to come up with another strategy.
So the team tries another tack. They tap the phones of a number of fundamentalist religious communities.
We had created a network of phone taps in every place where Paul Touvier could have been called.
Paul Touvier aurait pu être appelé, en fait. All wiretapping devices were remotely connected to the basement of my offices.
When you do phone taps, you hear many different voices. But when you listen to the same people constantly, you start to recognize voices. You know how they speak, what they're talking about, and who's there. That's the technique of phone tapping.
Dans le même temps,
and then we got a lucky break.
Chance pour nous.
An article appeared in a national newspaper talking about Paul Touvier's relationship with elements of the church.
By chance, an investigative reporter has also been delving into the war criminal's past. Like the police, the reporter concludes that Touvier is likely being helped by Catholic fundamentalists. The article gives investigators their first major break.
As soon as the article was published, we started overhearing phone conversations. Certain people were worried about how the press had discovered this information.
Right after the article came out, at one point, we heard a phrase we understood perfectly to be, "Our friend Paul is not going to be happy."
Notre ami Paul ne va pas être content.
For me, it was marvelous, very, very nice thing. And people were saying, We have to help our friend Paul. Paul is now under surveillance. We have to take care, and so on and so on.
One call in particular offers a strong lead. On the phone is Jean-Pierre Lefebvre, the head of a renegade right-wing Catholic group called the Knights of Notre Dame. The Knights are part of the fundamentalist movement. At the other end of the line, Dom Lafond, abbot of a Benedictine monastery called Saint Paul de Wisque.
It seems that the Wisque monastery and the home of Jean-Pierre Lefebvre could be two links of the chain.
Detectives have evidence linking war criminal Paul Touvier to a monastery in northern France and a secretive far-right Catholic sect.
I decided, with the agreement of the magistrate, to launch the operation. I sent two different teams, one in Wisque in order to make an investigation in the monastery, and the other team to the home of Jean-Pierre Lefebvre.
The manhunt intensifies. Belanger arrives at the Wisque monastery, armed with a search warrant.
It wasn't normal practice to enter religious institutions. We questioned Dom Lafond. He wanted to phone his superiors and tell them what was happening. He thought that would scare us.
Lafond was smiling, thinking we had no chance to find Touvier.
We conducted a search. Dom Lafond didn't believe it. Police just didn't search a convent.
Belanger grills the abbot, but Lafond insists he knows nothing of the war criminal.
We said we would stay with him. We detained him for 48 hours. He realized we weren't going anywhere.
Eventually, the abbot cracks. In a startling admission, he reveals he is part of a conspiracy to protect Paul Touvier.
He puts us on to the Knights of Notre Dame.
Now detectives pull in the leader of the Catholic sect, Jean-Pierre Lefebvre, for questioning.
When Jean-Pierre Lefebvre was in the hand of an investigator for interrogation, he started to deny to know Touvier.
But the team's already discovered that Lefebvre and Touvier share a dark past. The militant religious leader once fought alongside Nazi SS officers.
In the basement of the house of Jean-Pierre Lefebvre, the investigators discovered numerous documents related to World War II.
Like Paul Touvier, Lefebvre was one of thousands of French who betrayed his country. Touvier worked closely with the notorious Klaus Barbie. Barbie was known as the Butcher of Lyon, Touvier, the Hangman of Lyon.
Klaus Barbie was the head of the intelligence branch of the Gestapo office in Lyon, and Touvier was the head of the intelligence branch of the milice office in Lyon, and they were certainly in the same line of work.
But Barbie was German. Touvier had no such excuse. He was a traitor who terrorized his own countrymen.
80,000 Jews died in France during the occupation. About 76,000 of them were deported.
His activities as a member of the milice combine hounding Jews, persecuting, chasing down Jews, fighting the resistance, but also he becomes very much of a mafia-like figure.
Vladimir Zant's mother was at a Lyon synagogue when Touvier and his henchmen showed up.
Paul Touvier come with his truck and stop in front of the synagogue tilsit, and some men enter the synagogue. He took all Jewish people, among them my mother, and was directed to a prison in Lyon. then deported to Auschwitz.
It is crimes like this that have led detectives to question the leader of the Knights of Notre Dame about Paul Touvier.
Several hours later, the investigator came in my office saying he don't want to speak, he don't want to cooperate. It's why I decided to join the interrogation.
Recordon tries a ruse to get his witness to open up.
I made a remark saying there is other hunters who are on the track of Paul Touvier, and these people are going to work for their own interest and are very ill-intentioned regarding Paul Touvier. When I said this, Lefebvre looked at me carefully. Wiesenthal, Klarsfeld, I shrugged the shoulders. It could be.
He hopes Lefebvre will think it's safer to turn Touvier over to police than to risk Nazi hunters like the Klarsfelds or Simon Wiesenthal getting hold of him.
And I said, if something wrong happened to Touvier and his family, you will be responsible.
The ploy works. The former SS officer admits the Knights of Notre Dame have been funneling money to the war criminal.
Lefebvre told me that each month he sent 3,000 French francs, roughly $600 US, to women located in Paris.
Paul Touvier's flight from justice has been more than 40 years in the making. After the war, he was convicted in absentia of treason and war crimes.
Touvier, it manages to stay in hiding and to survive until the 20-year statute of limitations runs out on the charges against him. What he wanted was to be able to inherit and to move back into his father's home. Move in with his wife and children, lead a normal life, if you will.
While the charges against Touvier had expired, he was still banned from owning property in his hometown. He was keen to reclaim his property and his reputation.
The only way he could get an inheritance when his dad died was to get a presidential pardon from President Pompidou.
In the 1960s and 70s, Touvier still had friends high in the French government and clergy. After a long and vigorous campaign by a sympathetic bishop, in November 1971, he received his pardon.
When President Pompidou pardoned him of his last remaining charges, it backfired.
Protests erupted across France. Famous Nazi hunters Serge and Beate Klarsfeld spearheaded the demonstrations.
The reaction of the world of the resistance was impressive, many protests.
There was outrage that, first of all, that these crimes had essentially gone unpunished after all. Regardless of the legal questions, I mean, this man was a murderer, unquestionably a murderer.
We protested immediately, and we invaded even the house of Touvier.
Touvier was under siege. Desperate, he agreed to do a television interview in disguise to defend his war record.
But what could I have done? What? Faced with the Germans, who were the masters of the country.
But his victims weren't fooled. They filed lawsuits against Touvier. As a result, he was now charged with crimes against humanity, charges which hold no statute of limitation.
Touvier goes from being a man who looks like he's going to slide back into kind of a comfortable anonymity and live in his family home to a celebrity of the worst kind. And then he's forced to go into hiding again.
It's these charges of crimes against humanity that have led Recordon and his men to pursue Paul Touvier. Now, the detectives follow the money trail to Paris and the elderly secretary of a Catholic charity.
We confirmed that there was a network set up to collect money. The money was passed on to Touvier through a woman named Geneviève Penou.
Recordon pays a visit to Penou to question her about the money.
I explained to this woman the purpose of my investigation. But she answered she don't want to help. I was amazed by this kind of answer.
Finally, Recordon wears her down.
She requested to phone her priest in order to obtain his agreement, because she don't want to be in infringement with the divine justice. It was amazing. It was amazing. The priest advised the woman, please give the information to the investigator.
Madame Penou reveals that she has been sending money to Paul Touvier at a fundamentalist Carmelite convent 200 miles south of Paris.
For her, it was an obligation, according to the Catholic rule, to help this family.
At this stage of the investigation, things started to accelerate very quickly. So the team left Paris by plane. At that time, the police had their own planes, and 4 of us left. Another group went by car.
After 4 decades, the net is closing on Paul Touvier. But there is a real danger. If he gets wind of the operation, he will vanish.
It's why I decided to move very quickly.
French detectives are closing in on war criminal Paul Touvier. They have flown to his last known hiding place, a convent 200 miles south of Paris.
A sister was surprised about the huge number of police officers in front of her. I said, I am in charge to perform an investigation in your convent.
Donc on rencontre la mère supérieure.
We met the Mother Superior and the abbot. We told them why we were there. We had to conduct a search.
Je suis chargé de la perquisition.
The team questions the nuns, while Recordon confronts the abbot.
And I started to interrogate this priest. Touvier, I don't know Touvier.
Donc il y a une petite église.
There was a small chapel, behind some buildings and garages.
De garage.
I was at the entrance discussing with the priest when one of our investigators came to me saying, we have found some suitcases with the name of Paul Lacroix.
Dans le bâtiment.
In one building, we found some cases labeled with a name that we recognized as one of Paul Touvier's aliases.
Qu'on reconnaît comme un des pseudonymes utilisés par Paul Touvier. Et là,
we opened the cases and discovered Paul Touvier's past.
Tout le passé historique de Paul Touvier.
And the first thing we saw was the Iron Cross. I look at the priest. You don't know Touvier? My investigator looked at the document, Paul Touvier, and so on. And you don't know this guy?
Investigators haven't found the war criminal, but they have found solid proof that the fundamentalists have been sheltering him. In one trunk, they discover writings by Nazi propagandist Philippe Henriot. It is a direct link to one of the worst wartime atrocities committed by Touvier.
Philippe Henriot was the Minister of Propaganda under Vichy, and he was a hero of the milice.
Philippe Henriot was an extremely effective radio commentator. He was doing quite a lot of damage to the Allied cause. He was really getting somewhere with these radio broadcasts. The resistance assassinated him on the 28th of June.
And throughout France, miliciens groups and other supporters of Vichy decided to exact vengeance. The account that finally emerges is that he rounded up a number of Jews, and then he took 7 of these and took them out early in the morning at the end of June 1944, lined them up against the cemetery wall and shot them, and left the bodies as examples for people to see.
Paul Touvier must have been living there, but left very quickly. There were current photos of him with his children, his wife. This was our treasure. We had a photo. That was important because the most recent photo we had was from 1973. We questioned the abbot. He said he didn't know anything.
I say, you have to respect the French law. Now, where is Paul Touvier?
The Mother Superior takes matters into her own hands.
Mother Superior asked the abbot to swear on the cross that he didn't know anything. He was trapped. Mother Superior really shook him up. She made him admit that he knew where Paul Touvier was.
He said to me, Touvier, for 2 weeks, is at the Saint-Joseph Monastery in Nice.
It's a critical point in the case. But Nice is 500 miles south on the Mediterranean coast. There is no time to lose.
It was 11 p.m. Due to the fact that my team was very tired and more tired than me, I decided to take the wheel and to drive myself until Nice. Nothing could stop my investigation.
French detectives drive through the night. They're heading for a monastery in Nice. After more than a year, the hunt for war criminal Paul Touvier is entering the endgame.
We had to move fast. We hadn't slept since Monday. We've been on the go with no rest. We drove at 150, 160.
I took one photograph with me, and with this photograph, now I can put an image on a guy. Now Touvier, for me, was very well identified.
Colonel Recordon calls ahead to authorities in Nice. He asks them to surround the monastery so that no one can arrive or leave.
And I said it was a very important case. I cannot speak about it by phone, but I have in my pocket an arrest warrant.
At dawn, we arrived on the outskirts of Nice. There were already 6 or 7 undercover police officers surrounding the monastery. Recordon told my colleague and I to go around back so we could enter from the rear and the front at the same time. But we weren't sure if he was inside. We had our doubts. We just didn't know.
I knocked at the door, and a priest opened the door. He was surprised, and I suppose a little bit terrified.
The panicked priest tries to keep the investigators out.
I had placed my foot in the door, and violently I opened the door.
In the meantime, we were in the courtyard. broke down a door, and met up with Recordon.
En fait, on rejoint Recordon.
4 of us were inside, but there was only one central staircase.
L'escalier central.
And my investigators rushed in the staircase. I grasped the sleeve of the priest, and together we climbed the staircase.
At the top of the stairs, there were 2 corridors. Recordon went left with one colleague, and I went right with another.
Un autre collègue.
My investigator, a few seconds opening on each side, the door, and I followed, taking the priest by the sleeve. And at this stage, my heart was bumping quickly. And near the end of the corridor, I noticed an investigator stand still in the frame of the door. And in the middle of the room, I saw Paul Touvier.
After more than 4 decades on the run, Nazi collaborator Paul Touvier is cornered.
When I saw this guy standing in the middle of the room, instantaneously, I recognized him as Paul Touvier.
Paul Touvier had a distinctive look. He had piercing blue eyes.
Je me souviens de certains.
I remembered war films with blue-eyed Nazis,
Les nazis.
and that shook me up.
Choqué, quoi.
A few seconds later, a wife came, followed by her son and her daughter, crying. And Touvier, brusquely, nastily, ordered them, "Shut up. Go back to your rooms." What they did without a word. And I recognized the guy in charge of the intelligence service of the milice when he spoke to the resistant, to the Jew. I think it was the same guy, the bad guy, very bad guy.
Et on s'est aperçu que les 2 enfants.
As for his children, it was sad. They were 35 or 36 years old, and they'd never had a life. They had always lived in a monastery or abbey.
D'une abbaye.
Colonel Recordon called me to tell me that Paul Touvier had been arrested. This was a big moment for me, because all of the efforts we had put in together had concluded in a positive result. It was a clap of thunder. Fantastic.
For me, I won. I just won my investigation. I don't know how in English I say soulagé. I was released. After the Touvier arrest, I have a thought concerning the poor people in the concentration camps. And I thought, now is the justice time.
We had, after 40 years, finally arrested Paul Touvier. There was a flood of journalists.
Touvier faces 6 counts of crimes against humanity.
He read a statement to me. I dispute having committed crimes against humanity. I was only doing my job. He had no regrets.
The investigation has shone a revealing light on a dark and secretive corner of the French Catholic Church. Paul Touvier's arrest also shows that anti-Semitism is alive and kicking in modern France. Within days, "Death to Jews" is scrawled on a synagogue in Rouen. 5 years after Touvier's capture, his trial opens in Versailles, once home to France's kings and queens. Tensions run high in a nation still scarred by the war.
One of the big moments in the trial is that during the 80s, he kept these notebooks called the Green Notebooks. And while he, at his trial, denied that he had maintained the same animosities he'd had before the war, when the Green Notebooks are read at his trial, it's clear that ideologically, this is a man absolutely frozen in the past. It became clear that he was very much the same man who had joined the milice and was willing to carry out crimes. Touvier was a very hateful man.
These secret notebooks help seal Touvier's fate. He is found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to life in prison. It's an historic verdict.
Touvier was the first French citizen to be tried for and found guilty of crimes against humanity in a French court. And that's really quite extraordinary. There are not many countries that have prosecuted their own citizens for crimes against humanity.
I was looking for my mother all my life. Paul Touvier was the man who arrested my mother and sent my mother to Auschwitz. Paul Touvier has to assume the responsibility of my life, of my hell.
The hunt of Touvier, for me, was a classical inquiry. Challenging, demanding, and also the right will, the determination. It was possible to succeed.